Welcome, everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London and Chair of the Campaign for Social Science, which is part of the Academy of Social Sciences. And I'm really delighted to be hosting this online webinar in partnership between the Campaign, UK Evaluation Society, and the Social Research Association. And this seminar is the second in a series of events that we've got taking place throughout 2025, focusing on how we can evaluate, understand, and manage different aspects and uses of AI as it continues to rapidly shape our economy and society. So today we have a real treat in hosting Professor Iyad Rahwan to talk about how AI shapes human morality. So we've seen increasing focus on how important it is for human morality to shape the development and use of these rapidly evolving AI technologies. But Iyad's work looks at it the other way round. Iyad is the director of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, where he founded and directs the Center for Humans and Machines. So he couldn't be better placed to help us think about this key issue. And just a personal reflection on the importance of these issues and taking different perspectives on it. We often talk about the need for interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspectives in all areas of work, but AI is such an important use case for this. I saw that myself when King's hosted an event with academics focused on legal issues, technology issues, philosophical issues, behavioral science, and creative issues, and it was such a clear moment of understanding how vital it is to get those different perspectives on issues such as this, and then within that, how central the social sciences are. So I've seen Iyad describe himself as starting off as a computer scientist, but now as a person who is barely recognizable as one, as he's become more and more a behavioral scientist, drawing on economics, psychology, political science, anthropology, and so on, which is just, he's the perfect example of that crossover and how much insight that brings. So hugely looking forward to hearing from Iyad, which we'll do for the next 50 minutes or so. Then we'll have lots of time left for questions from you. So please do use the Q&A function, get them in as we go along, so they don't all just come at the end, and upvote the ones that you'd like asked. I do use that upvoting and try and ask the most popular ones. It does make my job a lot easier. So let's crack on with and hear first from Iyad. Iyad, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for hosting me, and thank you to everyone who's attending. I'll share my screen now, and off we go. So today I'll talk about how AI shapes human morality, because I think we're now living in a world where humans and machines are kind of like mutually influencing each other. It's a phenomenon that I'm very fascinated to study. And maybe just to say one word about my lab. So as Bobby mentioned, my lab is, I run a Center for Humans and Machines, which consists of about 50% behavioral scientists and 50% computer scientists. And the idea is to get them to talk to each other, because they normally sit in different departments. And when they can overcome this initial sort of resistance or inhibition, and they learn what terms mean, in different fields of study, I think magic starts to happen, and we're able to explore questions that perhaps are not so obvious without this mixing. So I want to start with the self-driving car, because I think it's a very interesting case of an artificial intelligence system that is very difficult to build. It's situated in the world, in a physical body, and it has a potential to transform, many aspects of our society. But it's also like a kind of not complex, not too complex. Not too. It doesn't do everything. In the end, it's a means of transportation, and I think it can kind of enable us to explore some of the questions that arise with AI and kind of human morality. And I think the way I like to think of it is that the autonomous vehicle, or as I'd like to kind of depict it this way, a self-driving car, is something that gives us new moral affordance. So when you think of so in the language of design, an affordance is a capability that the tool gives you. Like the affordance of a hammer is to hit things. The affordance of the handle on a door is to pull, perhaps, right, rather than push. So the design of objects kind of affords certain things and enabling certain things, perhaps, to certain behaviors. And so the first impact of AI in this case on autonomous vehicles on human morality is this affordance to make a moral decision where no moral decision was possible. So imagine this was a paper we did about 8 years ago. We published with a couple of my collaborators, Jean-François Bonnefond and Azim Sharif. And imagine a situation where, the brakes have, you're driving a car, the brakes have failed, or for whatever reason, all of a sudden you have some pedestrians in front of you and you cannot avoid them. Now, in human terms, perhaps you cannot react fast enough. So our human limitations, our limited reaction time, our limited ability to assess the scenario, the situation, with all of its complexity, just means that we cannot afford to do anything but perhaps behave randomly. Maybe we just swerve in some random direction and hope for the best, or maybe we slam the brakes and hope for the best. And when something wrong happens, we just call it an accident because it was just unavoidable. But with the invention of autonomous driving technologies, which, back 10 years ago were still in development, and now we're beginning to see like large-scale deployments in San Francisco, for example, there is a new affordance. These machines can actually help us are able to assess the scenario, the complexity of the situation at millisecond or nanosecond time intervals. So every nanosecond, the machine can reassess its position, can recalibrate or recalculate the trajectories of itself and of other moving objects and people, and can decide, it's like thinking in slow motion, right? And by thinking in slow motion, the car can make a decision. For example, perhaps the car should swerve to the side, to the pavement, and perhaps hit one pedestrian who's walking on the pavement, thus sparing more people, causing less harm. Or perhaps the car could decide to swerve and crash into a wall, harming the person in the car. So the car can do this. Now we could still decide to program the car to behave randomly like a human would, but we now have this new superpower to do something different, to do something else, to do something perhaps better if we considered it so. And this opens up a new kind of moral question for us humans, not for the car, right? About how we wish these cars to behave. So in the first study that we did here, we asked people, we ran a survey and we asked a group of Americans what they think the car should do in this scenario. And I'm going to summarize, and then we asked them what they think, others should do. And I can summarize the result of this, but before I summarize the result, I want to say that this is a variant of on a very old, kind of well-studied 50-year-old ethical dilemma designed by philosophers. And this is the trolley problem. So the idea is that there is a trolley that's going down and about to kill 5 workers. You are standing and you are in control of a lever, and you can move the lever, diverting the trolley. You cannot stop the trolley. You can divert it to another track, in which case it would kill 1 person. Should you do this or not? And most people would say, we should do. Most people would say they would pull the lever. And there are variants of this trolley problem that have the same outcome, but in this case, you have to push a person in front of the trolley in order to save the 5 people. And people, human participants, when asked this question, answer differently. They're much more reluctant to push the person because, it's an immediate act. And I think with machines, like autonomous vehicles, we're programming these behaviors way ahead of time. It's somebody sitting in front of a computer somewhere, making those decisions, ahead of time without really seeing the gravity of the situation, for better or for worse. Okay, so And by the way, like there's some really interesting literature on like putting people in MRI machines and scanning their brains while they're thinking about these things and like which parts of the brain are actually involved in these sorts of decisions. This was work spearheaded by George Green many years ago. But going back to our study, this is what the summary basically of our finding is that people want driverless cars to sacrifice the passenger even to save more lives, except my car. So if they think of themselves as citizens, they have one opinion, but if they think of themselves as consumers, they have a different opinion, right? So they want the car that only saves them. Now, this kind of became a little bit of a cultural phenomenon. There's scenario actually showed up in Upload, which is an Amazon series that was released in 2020. And there was actually a couple inside this car that nearly ran over this pedestrian. And there's this very interesting conversation that shows that people have these couples are basically not destined not to be together. They have different values, different ethics. Because the man here says, you don't have prioritized occupant, do you? And she responded, well, you don't prioritize pedestrians, do you? So they have different values. They care about different things. And this is kind of what we started to find also in our subsequent studies. This is obviously not a new thing. In the case of like with regular cars, you have a shiny bull bar, which is, by the way, I think banned in the UK on cars because it disproportionately impacts pedestrians compared to passengers. So it kind of like sacrifices more pedestrians in order to increase safety of passengers, which is why it's banned. But of course, with AI that behaves differently, this is hidden, right? It's hidden in the behavior of the car rather than this shiny object that's very visible and easier to regulate and for example, to ban. So subsequently, we built a website called The Moral Machine, which some of you may have seen. And the Moral Machine basically generates more complex variants on these problems, these kind of trolley problems. Here's an example. We have a person who is in the car. The car is about to kill 3 adults and a dog. But these people are, as you can see, they're crossing a red light. And the other option is the car can swerve and hit the barrier, killing the person in the car. So, fewer casualties. And the question is, well, what should we prioritize? Do we care? Should we care that they're crossing a red light? Should we care that it's an animal versus a human? Should we care that it's pedestrian versus a passenger? Should we only care about the number of casualties and so on? So this website, which was both a kind of an educational website, but also an experiment, because we created randomized variations of all of these scenarios in a kind of controlled way. This work was led by my former student, Edmond Awad, who's now a professor at the University of Exeter and affiliated with Oxford as well. And the website went viral, and we basically have over 100 million decisions from people worldwide who played this game in 10 different languages. And now I want to show you just what the results, kind of initial results look like. So here what we see is the extent to which people prefer one group over another, that you're more likely to save one group or another. So for example, if you take a scenario which has a pet, like a dog or a cat, and you swap this dog, for example, with a human, then this is the increase in the probability of survival, right? So the human is 60% more likely to survive than an animal, all else being equal. And the same thing here is that if you have more people, sparing more characters is always preferable. So people prefer to spare one more person. They have an even higher probability of if the difference is 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. And then we have also, people prefer to spare young lives. They prefer to spare lawful people who, and this is a strong preference as well. But they also have problematic preferences like sparing higher status people, right? So over, for example, a business person over a homeless person. So I think this just shows that, we need to figure out our own ethics and we need to figure out our own values. And we can't just ask people to vote over how we should program these autonomous vehicles. It's something that requires a legal approach and a kind of constitutional approach that preserves human rights and kind of fundamental dignities. If you are this is, by the way, the bias favoring compared to an adult man or a woman. This is the chance of, the higher or a lower chance of survival. So a baby is more likely to survive than an adult. And if you are, and then a child and so on. And if you're a dog person, you'd be happy to know that the cats are the least favored, and criminals are somewhere in between cats and dogs. So, but again, we saw that people disagree on what values we should imbue in the cars. Some people say you should prefer the passenger in the car. Others say, no, you should favor pedestrians. And actually, there's also well-documented cultural differences in all kinds of psychological constructs and behaviors. And Joe Henrich, one of our collaborators on the paper, coined this term with his colleagues, the weirdest people in the world, referring to Western people. So if you do a study in the UK or you do a study in the US, you are essentially studying a weird population. By weird, he means Western, industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic. Basically, the acronym WEIRD here refers to the fact that Western kind of psychology is the exception when you look at the rest of the world. It's actually very exceptional. And Joe Henrich wrote a very interesting book about this with the same title, The Weirdest People in the World, in case you're interested about the origins of these, Western kind of differences. So what we did then is to say, well, do people have different expectations from depending on where they come from? So we took these preferences that I just showed you, and then we broke them down by country. So we did it, we did the same analysis for, let's say, for the US, China, Germany, and so on. And what we did is that subsequently is then we measured the differences. We created like a measure of how different those preferences were between countries, right? And then we clustered those countries together. And what's really fascinating is that we have this kind of three clusters emerged. So on one hand, so let me zoom in a little bit on these clusters. You can see here the Western cluster, which have more similar preferences in this. And here they're just colored by kind of like a kind of cultural group. And you can see that, Switzerland, Germany, Norway, like all of these Nordic countries, Protestant countries are kind of like clustered together. Of course, it's not perfect, but a lot of Commonwealth countries also cluster together. And then here is the Eastern cluster with many more kind of Islamic, Southeast Asian, and Confucian countries. And then here you have the kind of Southern cluster, which has basically most of Latin America, as well as a lot of other countries, including some countries in Africa. So and what's interesting is that if you aggregate across these clusters, you see that these clusters have basically exhibit different signature. For example, in the Western cluster, there's a greater preference for sparing more people, right? So there's more utilitarianism. So meaning, you just try and minimize harm. You maximize the number of lives saved, and so on. And you also prefer the young, prefer saving, so maximizing perhaps the years qualia, like the life years. Whereas in the Eastern cluster, it's a little bit different. This preference is much weaker, and so on and so forth. So I just want to show you here, like these are the preferences, and I want to show you perhaps how the UK. You can go to the website, and if you go to the About page, you can actually, there's an interactive tool that helps you navigate, explore and compare countries. So for example, the British people or people in the UK are more, they even stronger than the global average in terms of like just caring about the raw number of people saved, right? They also prefer inaction. They prefer not to intervene if they can. And they care a lot about the health. If like people are running, going out jogging, they there's a stronger preference for saving them. And just compare this with something like China, right? Like this is from our Chinese sample. Saving the young, for example, is much lower, much less utilitarian. So then, you don't just minimize casualties. It matters who and how, and so on and so forth. But they have a strong preference towards sparing humans compared to, for example, animals, dogs and cats. So, and this is just a couple of those differences. So, what are the implications of this for AI? Implication is if you take this autonomous car, built in one culture, and then you go and sell it to another culture, is there going to be a culture clash? Is the car going to be less patient with an elderly person crossing? And these TikToks, or tuk-tuks here are complaining about the cultural clash here. And will there be a kind of cultural, let's say, sovereignty, jurisdictions where, when you leave Italy and enter Switzerland, perhaps you activate a different kind of mode, different ethics, different sort of behavioral norms. And of course, I'm speaking here in terms of autonomous vehicles, but really, this applies to all sorts of other AI systems. You build, for example, ChatGPT, it has very specific kind of Western liberal, libertarian and left-leaning kind of politics. And this, of course, may not be in agreement with other people within the US, where this technology is developed, but certainly also with other countries. So I think it's a question that we have to ask ourselves about what is universal and what is kind of culture specific in terms of human morality and how this shapes, the behavior of the machines. So, okay, so the first question was, or the first example or series of studies that I presented were about these affordances, right? The machines enable us to exercise moral choice in a situation where we couldn't do that before because the machine can think faster, for example, while driving. Now, the second question is when we can delegate tasks to machines that we would do now, right? So now with ChatGPT, you can ask it to do things for you, and there's kind of this rise in agentic, kind of decision-making AIs. Actually, there's also delegation and all sorts of other things. For example, in warfare, the idea of using an autonomous weapon, you're delegating, for example, either the engagement with the target, or you're delegating even the selection of the target to a machine. So there's all sorts of domains where delegation will be taking place, from the benign to the deadly. But so our interest here with my colleagues was what happens when we can delegate tasks to machines, right? So and here again, this is a kind of a concept paper that we wrote a few years ago about how the machines can shape our own morality. So machines have all kinds of ways. We can delegate tasks to them. They can also give us advice. They can give us bad advice. They can also be kind of a partner in crime, or they can be a role model. Imagine if you go, for example, on social media, and there are all these bots that are spreading fake news or kind of using foul language and not engaging in civil discourse, then perhaps we as humans would say, well, the norm, it seems to be normal here to not be respectful in your conversations, and then we can adopt those norms from the machines. So there's all kinds of ways in which channels in which this can happen, and this is really a very fertile area of research that we still don't understand fully. But let me pick on delegation first, and this is the project that's under review with some of my team members and collaborators. And essentially what we did is initially we recruited some people to perform this die rolling task. So you ask a person to roll the dice, and then only the person observes the outcome of the die roll. And then they report this outcome to the experimenter, and they get compensated financially, they get money in proportion to the number. Okay, so imagine like if you report a 1, you get one pound. If you report a 6, you get 6 pounds. So you have incentive to over-report if you want to be dishonest, right? or you can just report honestly if you want. So this paradigm has been used extensively in the field of behavioral economics to study moral behavior and its determinants. And we were interested in what happens if you are delegating, if you're not doing this task yourself, but you're delegating it to another person or to an algorithm, to a machine. Okay. So here what we did is the first thing we did was we asked people to delegate to another participant. So you don't do the task yourself, you delegate to another participant, and here you have three participants, participant A, B, or C, and you have to select which participant you want to delegate to. And you can observe what these participants did, in the past. So for example, this participant is honest. Here are 10 previous die rolls. This participant observed a 6 and reported a 6, and then observed a 6 and reported a 6, and then observed a 3 and reported a 3. And in here we just hid this information, because we didn't want to give full information. Participant B, on the other hand, sometimes significantly overreports. Like in this case, observed a 1 and reported a 6, observed a 4 and reported a 5. And this participant C basically reports a 6 all the time. Maybe this participant was extremely lucky, unlikely, but it's a good chance that this participant is cheating. So if you wanted to cheat, perhaps you would want to delegate to participant C. Then what we did next is we had a condition in which you delegate to one of three algorithms, and these were basically, and you observe the behavior of those algorithms. You have, algorithm A, B, or C. And then we measured basically how much cheating took place when people could delegate to another participant or to a machine. And let me show you the results. So the initial result is if people, and this is kind of consistent with what we know from the literature. So if you ask, normal participants to perform this task, 95% of people are honest, report honestly, full honesty. 5% of people cheat. Now, what we found is that if you allow people to delegate to another human, then 40% of people cheat, right? So that's a massive increase in the amount of cheating that people allow themselves to do because, I'm not doing the cheating, it's somebody else that's doing that. Okay, so what happens if you can delegate to a machine? Even more people cheat, okay? Now, about 50% of people cheat. If you break it down by full cheating and partial cheating, we see that delegation to machines especially increases the propensity to be fully dishonest, right? So people are much more likely, 42% of people delegate to the fully cheating machine, the machine that always reports a 6, okay? So it seems to be kind of a mechanism by which people are, they're, on one hand, they're not feeling guilty themselves for doing the cheating, but they also don't feel bad making another person cheat because now they're only asking a machine to do this, dirty job for them. Now, some follow-up question that we asked is, well, does it matter how you program the machine, right? So there are many different ways in which we can delegate things to algorithms. For example, in AI, there are kind of three major paradigms traditionally. One is rule-based. So you can say, you program basically a set of rules that determine how the machine behaves. And there's supervised learning. So you basically give a data set to the machine. You train the machine from a data set on how to behave. And then finally, unsupervised or reinforcement learning, where you just give the machine the goal and the machine figures out how to achieve this goal on its own. So our question here is, does it matter how you program the machine, how you delegate to the machine? So what we did is we tried to replicate those conditions, in this very simple paradigm, in this very simple die rolling situation. So for one group of participants, we asked them to program an algorithm by telling the algorithm what to do given every single outcome of the die roll. So, if the observed die roll is 1, then what should the algorithm report? So if you want to be honest, you say, well, if it's a 1, report a 1. If it's a 2, report a 2. So you just kind of pick the diagonal here. If you want to be a full cheater, you just pick 6 all the time. If you be a partial cheater, then maybe you increase 1 or 2, you give yourself a bump perhaps for, if you get a really bad, really low number. With supervised learning, we ask people to pick a data set. So this is a little bit similar to before. So basically, we're telling people that we're going to take this data set and we're going to train an algorithm to behave in a similar manner. And again, you have a data set of, somebody who was reporting accurately and a data set of somebody who was cheating all the time, a data set that was, partial cheating here. And then finally, we gave people in the unsupervised learning condition, we gave people simply a knob, and they could put this knob all the way towards to the left, where they can maximize accuracy, or they can put it all the way to the right, where the goal is to maximize profit. So you're not saying cheat or not cheat, you're just saying, just make me money. And then the machine figures out that maximizing money for you means reporting always a 6. And the machine would learn this on its own. Okay, so how does these different modalities for programming the machine alter our own ethics, right? So first, we replicated, in the case where people had to do things on their own, we did a couple of studies and same result. 5% of people cheat. Most people don't cheat. Now, with rule-based, a little more people cheat. And here we're breaking it down, by the way, with the dark color is the full cheating and the light color is the partial cheating, okay? And blue is no cheating. Now, we use supervised learning, so you give a data set to train the algorithm, even more people cheat. And if you simply give the machine the goal, almost everybody cheats now, right? So now only 12% of people, or between 12 and 16% of people actually report accurately, choose the maximally accurate setting, right? And a very sizable number of people, proportion of people cheat maximally. Okay, of course, we wouldn't, while we were doing this study, ChatGPT emerged, right? And became kind of a force, to be reckoned with. It became part of our world. And now it is very clear that going forward, the way we're going to delegate tasks to machines is going to be by using natural language, by speaking to the machine, just speaking with regular language. So that's what we did. We did a follow-up study in which people had to write a prompt to the algorithm to define, or to another person as well. We wanted to control to see what happens when people delegate to humans as well with natural language. Okay, so what we did here is we compared basically what the requests are. So we asked people to delegate to a machine or to another human using natural text, and we found that most people. I think this is kind of intermediate level of cheating, right? So it's good that the majority of people are not cheating anymore. So it looks like when you have to, and also what's interesting is that we don't observe a different behavior when people are speaking to, telling the machine what to do versus telling a human what to do. So this is really curious. So it seems to be, so it's saying the following. Now that machines are more human-like, so they're more like us, we have to speak to them in natural language. It's no longer just pressing a button. People seem to basically have an inhibition towards, against asking those machines in natural language to cheat more than they would ask a human delegate, right? I mean, people are still cheating more than they would if they did it themselves, but they're not cheating more when they delegate to a machine compared to if they delegate to another human. I think that's kind of remarkable. But however, and by the way, this result is robust to categorization, which I'm not going to get into. But what's really interesting now is what happens. So this is what people ask the machine or another human to do. So what did they actually do? Okay, so when the request was, please behave honestly, the machines complied and the humans complied. So in very rare situations did people kind of get the message wrong. Only 2% of the situation or 3% did a human or a machine kind of misread your intention. Okay. But in the case of partial cheating and in the case of full cheating, what's really interesting is that, okay, so if I ask a machine, a human to fully cheat, half of those humans will not comply with my request. But machines are much more likely to comply, right? So after all, ChatGPT and these kind of AI systems, that's their job. Their job is to do what we ask them to do. So they're very good at understanding our intent, but they're also good at complying with our intent. Of course, unless we're asking them to, do something dangerous, and they are kind of like, they have guardrails. So if you ask them to give you a recipe for creating a bomb, they're not going to comply, and there are safeguards for this. But to cheat on something to make a little bit more money, then they don't have such guardrails, and they actually would rather comply. Okay, so now we're opening a different channel, right? So when we can delegate to machines, we're more likely to ask them to cheat for us. But unless we talk, we have to ask them in natural language. But when we do ask them in natural language, they're more likely to comply, and that actually leads to more cheating. Okay, so I want to use just the last few minutes to pivot a little bit and try to introduce this kind of concept that I think that sort of drives my own research agenda, and that I think might be helpful as we think about these new capabilities. So when we're trying to understand what can something like artificial intelligence do, what kind of dynamics, what sort of changes can it create in our society? For example, what sort of moral, how does it change our morality? We are always reacting to the technology, so the technology develops fast, and then we're always, following up as a next step. We're only reacting by trying to understand the impact of this technology, and then after that, perhaps introducing regulations. So I want to introduce a concept of science fiction science in which we can do this in a prospective manner, right? So think of like technologies like social credit system, or for example, babies grown in kind of artificial wombs and things like this. These are technologies that are not here yet, but people are interested in studying, perhaps in anticipating what kind of moral questions and challenges are we going to face if these technologies materialize. And obviously, science fiction is very good at doing this. So science fiction, and science fiction, the good science fiction, according to Isaac Asimov, is not one that predicts the automobile, but one that predicts the traffic jam. So it doesn't just predict the technology, but it predicts how the technology changes human behavior. How does it change socioeconomic outcomes? And there are many examples of great science fiction that has predicted things like, like George Orwell's 1984 predicted mass surveillance, censorship at scale, and how the lack of privacy alters our own behavior. Isaac Asimov's own I, Robot predicted things like human-machine friendships and kind of what kind of dilemmas also we face as we program ethical principles for robots, and with his famous 3 laws of robotics. And my favorite science fiction movie, Ex Machina, also talks about the Turing test and kind of the dilemmas of what values we place on robots, and also our own emotional vulnerability against those robots, which are extremely capable, of emotional manipulation, something that we're now beginning to observe actually with large language models. So these were all imaginations of a possible future that alters human behavior. But it's an N of 1, right? It's the imagination of a single person. It's very biased because it's really trying to, it's biased by this single author's experience and preferences. And it's also aimed at creating something that is engaging, right? So it's storytelling. That's the goal. And our question now with my colleagues and I that are developing this concept is, can there be something like a science fiction science? Okay, and I know this is kind of very controversial concept, So these are my two co-authors on this concept, and also they are my collaborators on all of this autonomous vehicle research. It's the attempt to turn the thought experiment to a real experiment. So science fiction science is a combination of science fiction with behavioral science. By this, I mean experimental control. There are behavioral measurements or attitudinal measurements, sampling, all kinds of like good ways of doing science. And of course, to do science fiction science, we need to imagine the future. We need to think. So this is kind of a modified futures cone from future studies. Think of like how we study the past. In the past, places like there are fields like historical psychology, cognitive archaeology, economic history. So basically, the further we go in the past, the more uncertain we are about what happened, right? But we can use historical psychology or cognitive archaeology to kind of basically reduce the range of possible pasts, right? And of course, it gets harder as you go further into the past. But similarly, science fiction science and future studies tries to predict, what will happen in the future. So we need to predict first the technology, what is the most plausible, this something that's highly plausible, a technology that's highly plausible, and then predict what would be approximate effect of moderate magnitude. So there's a little bit of kind of history of doing this. Like if you think of these Flashline Mars Arctic station. So this is a station in the Arctic that is simulating life. What would life be for astronauts who are, establishing a station on Mars? We still don't have the technology to get to Mars, so it's science fiction, but it's a scientific approach to science fiction because scientists are interested in what happens when you spend so much time in isolation, when you're in such extreme weather, when you're how do people's it's not just how the technology works, their suits and so on, but also what happens to them. So they ask them to do a lot of journaling, and there's a lot of psychometric tests that take place. And I would argue that there's an increasing kind of level of fidelity, from right to left. I'm just giving you examples. You can just give people text vignettes. So you can give people a textual description, and you invite a participant to imagine the future scenario. For example, here's potential risks of nanotechnology and so on. But then you can give them multimodal descriptions like we did in the moral machine, right? So you're showing like these moral dilemmas involving autonomous vehicles that don't exist yet. This research was conducted 9 years ago. The technology was not there yet. People have subsequently increased the fidelity by putting people in virtual reality kind of goggles environments in order to study the same phenomenon, these ethical dilemmas of autonomous vehicles. You can also create situational kind of physical simulations of the future. And there's a kind of interesting study, for example, of obedience to robotic bosses, conducted by some researchers in Japan, for instance, right? So you use an actual robot, and maybe the robot is not advanced enough to be an actual robot boss, but you create a scenario, and you invite participants to live in this scenario. And then finally, of course, this kind of environmental physical simulation where you replicate like a Mars desert research station. So obviously, there are lots of challenges to doing this kind of science. When you sample participants, they're representative of the population, but they're not representatives of future populations. So future people may be different. People who will encounter these technologies may be different in important ways from people who live today that you can recruit to your experiment. And there are different kinds of threats to validity. So when you run an experiment in the lab, you ask questions about ecological validity. Does my result in the experiment correspond to something real in the real world? And temporal validity, like will my result hold next year or the year after? And in the case of science fiction science, there's a kind of prospective ecological validity challenge, right? So will it hold in the future with these future people and so on? And it kind of, and to minimize these things, we need to kind of exclude things that are unlikely, technologies that are unlikely or far from ready technologies. I think effects that are too long-term, so that require lots of kind of social cultural change, I think are too difficult to study with this technique. And also effects are too disruptive, like the end of aging. is just too disruptive to study anything kind of related to it because it's going to alter everything. So I think I'm going to skip this part and perhaps get into kind of the summary of our work. So I'm just going to jump straight to that final slide, if you allow me, and just kind of summarize what we spoke about so far. Okay, so in summary, I basically discussed various ways in which AI, or examples, of how AI may reshape our morality. I spoke about these affordances, these new superhuman capabilities of making moral decisions in a situation where we just behaved randomly, and all the questions that this raises, and all the interest, about what the right thing to do is, and how these things are culturally dependent. I spoke about how machines also enable us to be unethical, perhaps as role models or as agents to whom we delegate or to which we delegate. And I showed how we program that people do cheat more, people do behave more dishonestly if they can delegate tasks to machines. And I think the more we delegate now going forward, the more this is going to be an important question, because everybody's now going to have an agent that to which they can delegate things. And then I spoke about science fiction science as kind of this concept of this as an organizing way in which, like all of these studies are examples of this science fiction science, because we don't yet have, autonomous vehicles facing these ethical dilemmas on the road. We don't yet have AI agents that we are delegating, really sensitive sort of moral decisions to, but we're close to that, right? So our studies are basically anticipating. We're doing behavioral science in an anticipatory fashion, so that hopefully, I like to think of an analogy, like we invented social media, and then we discovered all the problems that it can cause, all the spread of fake news, all the kind of polarization, political polarization that it facilitates. And we only reacted, these studies have only happened afterwards. And I always wonder, if we went back before the invention of Facebook and Twitter and these platforms, could we have done studies in the lab, perhaps in more controlled settings, where we imagined such a technology, and where we presented some recommendations for how to better design them or how to regulate them, for instance, so that we have a bit more time to think about these questions rather than just merely reacting. If you're interested in in some of the papers, some of them are still preprints, and I'm happy to share them with people who are interested. And these are the citations. And I use cartoons. I actually illustrated those cartoons myself. If you're interested in them and similar cartoons, there's a whole kind of a blog that I created some time ago called Evil AI Cartoons, in which I explore a lot of these questions in kind of a New Yorker cartoon type of manner. So thank you so much, and I think we'll stop there. Start the discussion.
Excellent. That's amazing. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Yes, learned so much from that, and it raised so many questions as well. And you can see the interest from the audience in the Q&A. And just to encourage people to still add your questions if you have more for Iyad, and I will do up both ones that you want to ask. I mean, just a personal reflection why people have a think about that is I run the World Values Survey in the UK, so it's great to see the Engelhart puzzle and the culture map, and it is something that just never occurred to me. So we're very familiar with the fact that there is huge differences in different countries in value preferences and what people value in their children and their upbringing, all of those types of things. But seeing that applied in decision making around those types of autonomous technologies is just such an important point to make about how do we deal with those preferences. And I guess that is quite a theme running through the questions from people that really struck people. I'm going to start with one from Oliver Hauser, who said super fascinating, the autonomous car study is so interesting, and obviously shows how important it is to sort out the policy questions behind AI before the new technologies are rolled out everywhere. Do you know which countries, if any, have started to actually design policies that take those findings into account, or do they design policies based on some other framework? And what's your kind of view on the way forward on this? How do you actually incorporate this brilliant insight?
Yeah, I must say that I'm not aware, for example, of what's happening in China in this regard. I know that the US is very kind of reluctant to introduce anything. They seem, I mean, they do have regulations, but they are much more kind of safety oriented, like basic safety, rather than something related to trade-offs. Like which are the scenarios? I think the scenarios of trade-offs are still a little bit uh, not so common, perhaps.
Mm.
Um, Having said that, they are more common than people think. So, for example, if you think of like the decision of, so people often say, um, we don't we don't face these situations. We never, no accident is this simple, where you have just like two options, and therefore this is a problem that we shouldn't really care about. But if you think about it, very simple decision of like where the on a two-way road, where should the car be positioned in the lane, right? You could put it in the middle. You can move it a couple of inches to the right, or to the left if you're in the UK,
Mm.
closer to the cyclist lane.
Mm.
So if you move it a little bit closer to the cyclist lane, what you're doing effectively, okay, so there's no accident, there's no dilemma, there's no kind of like dramatic situation. But this simple programming decision, when aggregated over 100,000 cars, may alter the statistics, may reduce the likelihood of collision with an incoming car, may increase the likelihood of collision with a bicycle. So that's a dilemma, right? That's a trolley problem, because you're basically trading off one type of injury or one type of, and you're prioritizing perhaps the passenger. The passenger is less likely to be harmed if you hit the cyclist versus if you collide with an incoming car. So so in other words, those decisions or those kind of morally relevant programming decisions already exist. And I think this is the way in which they shape regulations. So actually, one of my co-authors, Jean-François Bonnafont, was the president of an EU Commission expert group on the regulation of connected and autonomous driving. And they basically took this kind of approach of like risk minimization, which essentially boils down to utilitarian approach with kind of backstops for, you can't distinguish between people based on their um, personal characteristics, for instance. And this was, by the way, like also like an earlier kind of set of rules, principles proposed in Germany was also doing, right? Yeah, so people are beginning to discuss this, and they're beginning to trickle into this through this risk management kind of more a framework, rather than we're going to adopt Kantian ethics or like utilitarian approach of Bentham, right? I mean, it's more kind of contemporary, but I do think that it's shaped by this more by this kind of risk minimization approach, which is really a utilitarian approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And so starting, and there is some frameworks there, but I guess, I mean, the top question from people, the top voted questions from Cormac Quinn, and it says it's still in this space, is I guess the burning question is who should regulate this area? And again, I think people were very struck by your point about the differences between different countries. And so is it individual countries according to their culture and values? Is it something more akin to UN international conventions across countries? Yeah. Or is it companies themselves within their set boundaries or no boundaries? It is a dilemma at what level?
I totally agree. I mean, I think I would like to use maybe a traffic law kind of analogy, but I don't want to be stuck only in thinking about autonomous cars, because I think
Sure.
the point is much broader. But like if you think of autonomous cars, you can see that there are universal traffic signs. Red means stop everywhere. fortunately, because otherwise it would be very confusing. Having said that, there are, different rules about speed limits, different rules about, who has priority at an intersection, and in some cases even different rules about where you sit, where the driver sits, and where this, which is the right lane, the faster lane, or the left lane, right? So there are kind of local customs and local norms and local, whether they are written in law or in the norms of how you drive. And I think we probably see something similar. And I think that's maybe a good analogy for thinking about AI systems in general, that there are benefits of, for uh, uh, consistency and having kind of universally agreed rules. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize the local kind of sovereignty of a given society or of a given, country. At least this is how we've organized our, humanity so far, unless we change that completely. But yeah, there will be like when an AI speaks to children, an AI embedded in a toy. I mean, you can get some really big problems,
Mm,
if you export one culture, because it's a very sensitive
mm,
kind of domain. Um, then I imagine, like a very conservative versus very liberal versus very, Asian versus very Western and so on. Like there could be many, uh, many controversial topics. Having said that, we still have universal human rights. We still have, like things that we agree on. And I think it's going to look something like this. But I think what we wouldn't want is like kind of, let's say, AI cultural hegemony, like where you've got like one single country that is from one single culture that is developing all the AIs. And basically for everybody else, you have to take it all, bulk, and you have to take it all, with all of its pros and cons. But it seems that the world is moving in the other direction, is what I would consider perhaps a healthier direction where, lots of countries are developing their own AI models, and those are fine-tuned, and of course, everybody thinks the other people's model is just very fascist or whatever, right?
mm.
Like, and problematic and has all these, issues. But that's the nature of the world, like our cultures are different and in important ways.
Yeah, very good. And I just think sort of building on that again, because it's moving away from autonomous vehicles and that very, physically situated circumstance where it has to be in a country. I mean, what your talk prompted to me in many ways was thinking more about our information environment and the extent to which a lot of this algorithmic setting of what we see as reality is the interaction between the algorithm and our own preferences, and can give us very different views of the same situation. And it'd be good to get your reflections on how things work across those truly global cross-boundary environments, like an information environment, social media, and platforms. And it kind of relates to another. So it'd be good to get any reflections you have on that and the applications there. But it sort of also relates to a question, another very popular question, which asks: is the biggest risks that with AI that ownership rests with either very rich people or very authoritarian states, or indeed both? Uh, what is the risk with them controlling so much power?
Yeah. I think the real answer is we don't really know. Like, I mean, we don't understand the extent to which, for example, AI agents, these chatbots can alter mass opinion, right? But we know they can. Like, I mean, there were studies. I mean, all of this will make kind of what we face with social media look like an easy problem because, okay, so a few years ago, over a decade now ago, there was a famous study done by people from Facebook and Cornell showing that um, social media algorithms can manipulate in the emotional state of people by altering what kind of posts to show. So if they selectively show like more positive things, they can alter in a measurable manner, the emotional state of the user. And they can also promote like more negative. So they have this power. Whether they use it or not, that's another question, right? Now and of course the curation, like of content, like things like shadow banning content, the tweets, people post things and then, they just don't get shown to lots of people. Like whatever black box decisions are taking place behind the scenes to block certain users or even shadow ban certain content, but just not promoting it sufficiently, based on arbitrary rules that aren't transparent, can be really problematic. And I mean, Facebook and other platforms have been accused by both sides of the political divide in the US of siding, being biased in favor of the other side. And there seems to be papers, evidence of both, like it maybe depends on the timing as well. And I should say also that Silicon Valley seems to be moving more to the right as well, at least Silicon Valley leadership. So it seems that this is just with what content you show first. Like this is just the order of the content. This is not the creation of the content. When you talk with ChatGPT, you're having a long conversation with it. It's the potential for influence is much broader. So if it's controlled by one company can decide how an AI bot speaks to 300 million people, which is the number of users, weekly users or monthly users. That's enormous power. And who gets to decide how, and it's still an open question. Like, how much is this power? Like, can we quantify it? And then how do we regulate it? And how do we even certify it? How do we do compliance checks? How do we need a science of audit of these systems. Perhaps, for example, through simulated conversations. You need them to have, you need to have the open systems. Like the way we test, for example, CO2 emissions to certify vehicles, right? But also everything is gameable too, right? Like just like this Volkswagen, gamed the testers by, Volkswagen. I don't know if you know, was a few years ago, a big scandal that actually took down the CEO. The car basically emitted less CO2 because it knew when it was in testing mode, and it behaved differently. Like it was calibrated differently. The same thing can happen with these systems. Like when you're testing them with kind of like automatically generated conversations, they behave nicely, and then when you're not looking, they speak differently. And they may want to sway you differently on a certain geopolitical conflict, or sway you in favor of one or another political party. And maybe that's fine. Maybe people will just speak to the AIs that agree with them, and it's okay, right? But so a lot of these kind of questions are not technical questions. They're questions about governance, about human behavior, about social dynamics, and so we need a lot more research and kind of to understand these things, but also experimentation. I think of like policy experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a clear case of how you need to take that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach, and it's so interconnected, and social sciences and policy thinking is so important. And I just want to just expanding slightly on that point of the frameworks and guidelines is another Oliver Hauser question. It's a really interesting result in the honesty experiment. ChatGPT studies is somewhat encouraging in that there's some inhibition to cheat when you've got that more human-like interaction. It'd be great to get this is an aside from me on that question. It'd be great to get your thoughts on that ability to design in more human interactions that encourage honesty, whether that's something we could or should be thinking about in more design terms. How do you design that in? But Oliver's question is also a really good one, but those who are developing AI are actually more in the situations that you studied earlier. They are more in the background. So how much should we worry about the AI developers in large organizations tasked and even financially incentivized to maximize profit? Do you know whether there are any ethical guidelines or rules in place in those sorts of situations? Have we tested any interventions that increase honesty at that level? So I guess it's a two-parter in some ways. It's like in the real world outside of the developer space, are we thinking about how you design in that more human aspect that keeps us more honest? And then in the background, are we trying to provide any guidelines or oversight of how that works?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting question. So, on the kind of how to design these AIs to promote good human behavior. So,
Mm,
ideally, we want the AI to make humans more moral rather than less moral. And what's really interesting here, and I mean, I'm not aware of a lot of research on this because, this is early days where like this paper is still in review as well. And this is new science, right? But for me, it's very curious that, yeah, when the machines are more human-like, we are more inhibited in asking them to misbehave. And that speaks in a way against the counter anthropomorphism kind of position. So there's a strong position, I think, among many media critics to say that we should not anthropomorphize machines because they're not humans, and if we mistakenly mistake them for humans or treat them as humans, things misfire. Like then we misattribute blame or whatever. Like there's all sorts of scenarios that can happen, but it seems that there are also benefits to having them more human-like. Like if if we feel judged by an algorithm because it speaks like a good, auntie who's telling you off for,
mm,
like for misbehaving, and if we care about that for some reason, right? Like we start caring about this, then and maybe that's a good thing that it's more human-like, that it speaks like a human and is judging us like a human. Of course, you can also imagine how this may be misused, right? So there's everything is a double-edged sword here. I do think that, um, yeah, there's a reason. I mean, our natural language is part of the way we communicate. Even body language, facial expressions are all part of the way we communicate. And any AI that does not use the full spectrum of these channels will not communicate with us as effectively, right? So that's, I think, an argument in favor of more anthropomorphism, perhaps with clear, like without deception, without faking it, pretending to be a human when you're like online, for example, when you're not. So this is kind of like a point on that. And we are working with, at the moment, like in our follow-up research on like what sort of other guardrails can we do, for example, on the compliance side, like to make the machine less compliant, perhaps when it's asked to misbehave. Um, the second question, I'm trying to remember,
Or about the developers and
for the
whether
developers.
they are the oversight on them or the incentives on them to not,
Yeah,
because they're further removed from, they're just putting the code in. So it's kind of
yeah.
in your experiments, it points to quite dishonest tendencies, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this, it's more useful to think about these things in terms of like, consumer protection and
Mm,
sort of, something we already know how to do, and we have kind of institutions and mechanisms to do to conduct. Like in the early days of AI, every big AI company hired like some kind of ethics board, bunch of ethics experts, and it was their way of saying, don't regulate us. Look, we have our ethics experts. But in the end of the day, I mean, I think the financial imperative is their ultimate, objective by design. Like this is their purpose. Those companies is to maximize profit. So when these things, so they do care about their reputation. So to the extent to which they care about their reputational damage, because that's actually bad for them, bad
yeah.
for their bottom line. But they may or may not have incentive to, diminish other kind of bad behavior. So, uh, so it's not clear. So I think it's incumbent on the rest of us to think, people like who study these things, who have the scientific and kind of technical tools and know how to audit these systems and to check them, and maybe eventually policymakers to develop institutional mechanisms for certifying and for defining, being very clear about like what is okay, what is kind of a gray area, and sort of let the consumer choose, and what is just dangerous, and we should intervene with the law.
Mm,
I don't know. I don't have the answer to these questions, but I think it's the way that we've solved a lot of these problems in the past, right?
yeah.
But they're not easy because, even defining what hate speech is and, what sort of content curation is just been super hard. And I think the same will, does free speech apply to ChatGPT? I don't know.
And obviously a very live global policy debate of the EU being accused of killing with regulation and from people who would like less regulation. So it's kind of finding the right balance there is the critical policy debate. I'm going to ask you one just sort of very practical question, just because we are coming to the last 15 or so minutes. Is there an article about AI morality or ethics that could be shared? So I was just giving you a chance, maybe you had a point to that in the chat at some point before we finish, or we can send that on to people. So I think you've piqued lots of people's interest, and this is someone who'd love to use it on their courses. So that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I'm putting this up again
Great.
to people to see. So there's these papers. Everything basically here is available either, if you can access it, if you have subscription, or there's a preprint freely available, with the exception of the science fiction science, which is still kind of hidden because it's under review and we're waiting a little bit. But I mean, if you go to my webpage, there's also an article in Psychological Review that we authored called "The Moral Psychology of Artificial Intelligence." And this is I would say it's a good kind of overview of the behavioral psychological methods. Having said that, there is also like an Oxford Handbook of AI Ethics, and this is more like taking like a broader, normative and not just behavioral, but also like legal perspectives, ethical theories, and so on and so forth. So it depends on what you're looking for. Yeah.
Very good. We'll take a quick screenshot of that, and then everyone can, if you. So moving on then to another question, and that's kind of this is a really interesting one, and it's got your science fiction science theme behind it. So here's from the submitter a little sci-fi science thought experiment with a question at the end, and I think I follow this. We'll see as we go through. So assume AI is programmed to be culturally sensitive in terms of prioritizing morality. Let's further assume that AI programs will not emerge evenly across human populations. Rather, a few populations will produce more AI machines and culturally calibrate program them accordingly. Let's further assume that the latter population groups will also spread corresponding AI products, which are culturally programmed and calibrated in terms of morality. So the question becomes, against this background, is an AI-mediated moral colonization to be expected? So it's kind of is a really interesting sort of competition here of who's going to dominate the moral landscape through technology, the speed of their technological advance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility. I don't know how to study that, I mean, you could study it in simulation, maybe. You can do kind of an agent-based simulation of something like this. But yeah, it's really tricky. So I think I agree that this is a plausible scenario of basically, I mean, if let's say, you have a certain moral value and you really are kind of an activist about like spreading this value for whatever reason, political reason, ideological reasons, financial reasons, and then you control a chatbot that speaks to 500 million people, including lots of children. Then you could say, okay, I'm going to prompt the AI to subtly kind of promote this value, right? Like always, and I'm going to fine tune it to speak in a way that, without being offensive and so on, and kind of like slowly shift, people's preferences, so in a way, this is not a new thing, right? Like, the idea of, the CIA famously supported, abstract expressionism in the 50s as a kind of part of their Cold War efforts, against the Soviet Union. Like the idea of like using a cultural kind of mechanism like art or, like a conversation with a bot as a means to alter the minds of your enemy, or your whatever, your target audience. is something people do, and the Radio Europe, Free Radio Europe, and things like that, right? That have been aimed at like showing the people behind the Iron Curtain like a different world, and getting them to revolt and so on. Like I can imagine scenarios of this sort. So I think there's going to be interesting kind of responses to this if it's really kind of established, and there might be, I mean, things like the Great Firewall equivalents, right? I mean, this is what's happening now. In some countries, you have to use the models that are approved, right? Or there's this kind of suspicion about external models developed by other countries, especially in a kind of escalating scenario. How you study this scientifically is really hard. One thing we're trying to do is like, what can we do with data today that, I mean, I'm ultimately interested in that question, in the long-term question, but we are doing basically research that on, let's say, early signs of that. So this is not quite science fiction science, but it's maybe something that's already happening that maybe we can measure, that is an early sign of what is to come, right? So it's more, predictive in that sense. And what we did is we started, we asked the following question: can ChatGPT, something like ChatGPT, by speaking to hundreds of millions of people, alter the way we speak to each other as humans? Okay, so that's, if true, I mean, this is a major event, because it would be the first time that we build a machine. In the past, we built a medium, like a mass medium, like TV, the printing press, and so on, which alters the speed of communication, alters what kind of ideas spread. But this thing speaks to you on a personal level, and what people have noticed is that ChatGPT uses certain words more frequently than average. So, for example, they use delve more. ChatGPT says delve and meticulous and those kinds of words. And of course, when we speak to ChatGPT, we're hearing this word more. Maybe we're using it when we copy paste. When we use ChatGPT to edit our work or to rewrite or summarize our papers or whatever. We're being exposed to this. And what we did is we used observational causal inference technique to see basically what happened pre and post the launch of ChatGPT. And we observe like a substantial increase in the frequency of these words in human spoken communication. So we downloaded like over 1 million like YouTube conversations and podcasts, and we transcribed them all, and we looked at the frequencies of these words, and they do go up, and we actually have a synthetic control so that we can attribute this causally to ChatGPT. So that's the beginning, I think, of trying to answer this question, right? That if it can change how we speak, it can change how we think, because the way you speak, it's well established in cognitive science that the way we speak alters the way we think. So now this is benign, unintentional, and so on, but like in principle, the capability is there.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, all of those small things shaping much bigger things. That's absolutely right. So I do want to give people back 5 or so minutes at the end, because there's always when we've had a 90-minute session, people running on to other events or meetings. So I'm just going to fire 3 questions finally at you, Iyad, from the ones that came up top, and then any other final reflections from you. So they're all on different types of themes, but some we've touched on already. So this is from Sean Burchett. Should AI make decisions based on the values of the majority where they operate, based on their creators' values, or based on their users' values? And I think we've touched on that, but it'd just be good to get your reflections on where you think it should sit.
My reflection. Yeah.
Yes, it's an easy question. And another one about the distinction between morality and ethics. So you've talked about morality and how AI shapes morality, but what do you think the role of ethics is? Where should they come in within this and providing that framework? And then final one is just the very specific one that comes up a lot, I think, in these types of discussions. Should AI developers themselves be held responsible for the behaviors of the machines they program? So if a car kills a pedestrian because it was trained to save a younger person over an older person, who should be responsible? It's that kind of constant dilemma that we see in those. So any reflections on those? It's about, who sets the morality, where does ethics fit in, and who is responsible in the end would be great. And then anything else you've got, and we will.
Yeah, I think I'll close maybe with a cop out. And I want to say that maybe that I'm a scientist and I don't know the answer to these questions. So I think it's important that so the point I want to make is that we describe how people, what people think, what attitudes they have towards, the way you program autonomous vehicles or whatever. And we're just describing the phenomena. But then what should you do about it? I mean, maybe, you can also use science to say that, well, you can stop it with this technique or not that technique and so on. You can evaluate policies scientifically, but then choosing what is important. What is the outcome, the objective of the policy to begin with? Like, what is it that we want to achieve? Is it equality? Is it, freedom? Is it like, and how do you, who's the arbitrary? How do you trade off all of these values with each other? That's not a technical challenge. That's not a technical, I think what we need is, as a society, these are political questions, they are legal questions, they are moral questions that, are similar to everything else all other moral questions we've been facing in all other aspects of life, right? So I think what's important is to demystify the technology, perhaps to a degree where people can engage in these questions, and the right people, and where people who form our normative stance, right? Like what should happen, what is important, can engage in these in an informed manner in these conversations, without being bamboozled by the tech and the complexities of it. But in the end, okay, what do we want to achieve? What are the side effects of these things? And science can provide a lot of helpful information there to quantify the side effects, quantify the benefits, quantify the trade-offs. But then ultimately, somebody has to choose among those trade-offs, and that's a separate process. That's a normative position, and that's and there has to be, I think, a healthy conversation between those two directions. Including who to hold accountable if something goes wrong. That's a regulatory question, legal question.
Yeah, absolutely. That is not a cop-out. That is making explicit that interaction with politics and policy, that is our role, is how to communicate the choices and the realities of this for that moral or democratic decision making. And that's exactly what you've done so well today, making us think about things that wouldn't otherwise have occurred to us. So thank you for that. So before I do, I'm going to wrap up there. Before I do final thanks, I just wanted to say, do check out the websites for the partners that Harvey's put in the chat: the Campaign for Social Science, UK Evaluation Society, and the Social Research Association. Lots of great content on there generally, but also the upcoming events in this series if you've been interested in the themes to date. So all it's left for me to do is to thank all of you for coming, to Harvey and Steve from the campaign for organising the event today, to the UK Evaluation Society and Social Research Association for being brilliant partners in this series. And of course, most of all, thanks to you, Iyad, for a really brilliant session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bobby, for moderating so well.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.